part of my Lynch series, I'm going to be reviewing Lost Highway. This is David Lynch's 7th feature film and his first after his work on Twin Peaks, which kind of took him away from film for a little while. It stars Bill Pullman, Patricia Arquette, Balthazar Getty, and for some reason, Richard Pryor in a strange cameo, as well as Marilyn Manson, who is one of the worst people probably living on Earth right now, and whose work in this movie I cannot show on YouTube for legal reasons. But unfortunately, Marilyn Manson being a horrible person is a great segue into what I think Lost Highway is primarily about, which is about this like masculine anger and violence, specifically violence towards women. It's kind of difficult to explain Lost Highway, but I'll briefly give a plot synopsis here. The film starts following Fred, who kills his wife, or maybe doesn't, I don't really know, but whenever he is on death row, he mysteriously transforms into a teenager, 20-something guy named Pete, played by Balthazar Getty, and then eventually these two identities sort of converge into like this weird, surreal, Lynchian nightmare in the final 30 or so minutes of this movie. The movie is pretty neatly cut into 3 acts. Again, the first one being the Bill Pullman character, the second one being Balthazar Getty, and then the third one being them coming together. I think the first act is peak Lynch. It slowly builds up this dread before showing a truly harrowing image of the wife killing. But when it takes an abrupt U-turn to Pete in the second act, I think the movie falters a little. Firstly, because I think it kind of has to slowly build itself back up after that huge payoff. And secondly, because Balthazar Getty is really just not Bill Pullman. What Pullman is doing at the beginning of this movie is riveting. He's like quiet and brooding, but there's always like this strange, restrained violence that is bubbling just underneath the surface. And Balthazar, in comparison, delivers a pretty stiff performance. I don't think his dynamic with Arquette is nearly as interesting as Pullman's. And as the movie starts to get into its, weird stuff, Balthazar seems to have a little bit of trouble like keeping up with the strangeness and delivering the complex emotions that are necessary to be a Lynch protagonist. So once Pullman comes back into the fray in the third act, the movie really gets going again, and despite that little hiccup in the second act, it ends up really getting its stride again and delivering, I think, one of Lynch's best finales in his entire filmography. In comparison to the rest of his movies, I think Lost Highway is probably the darkest. Lynch is often described as being a very dark filmmaker who makes very dark films, but there's always like some tinge of optimism or sometimes humor to his films. But this is not the case with Lost Highway. It doesn't have like the bright color palette of Blue Velvet or the zaniness of Wild at Heart, or like the soapy ridiculousness of Twin Peaks. There's not really much humor or personality in the dialogue for the film to hide behind. And by stripping all of this away, you're left with one of the most harrowing movies in Lynch's entire filmography. The colors are muted, the atmosphere is ominous, the performances are really restrained and quiet. The violence is also very grotesque and unflinching. The reveal of Pullman in the first 20 or so minutes of this movie in the act of committing murder is super visceral. The gore is like so exaggerated and over the top that it should come off as absurd, but the movie plays it so straight that it just ends up being deeply unsettling. And when we're talking about unsettling stuff in this movie, I guess we'll get into maybe my favorite part of this movie, which is this mystery man character. I don't know who this actor is. I've never seen him in anything else, but he is absolutely terrifying. It's probably because the film swells the music and like heightens the intensity anytime he's on screen, but I also just think he's really creepy. His symbolic meaning seems pretty straightforward to me. He's like this physical manifestation of all of Fred/Pete's like darkest desires and like worst instincts. Fred's very possessive and jealous nature towards either iteration of Arquette's characters start off as like small doubts into his mind, but they never turn into action until the mystery man appears. I'm a little more unsure about what's going on with the dual identities here, and I'd rather leave that ambiguous than dissect it to death. But I do think Lynch is trying to say something about how no matter what, these characters, or maybe just like men in general, can't really escape that dark nature within them. I think it could also be a fantasy in Fred's head as he's like on death row. He starts imagining himself as Pete, this really like charming guy who can get whatever girl he wants and is like this perfect version of who he wants to be. But even this perfect version of himself can't escape what he ends up doing. Again, I could be oversimplifying it, and knowing Lynch, there's probably a bunch of things going on that I really don't understand. But I think the great thing about Lost Highway is it's very easy to understand based on feel rather than plot. I have two minor complaints on Lost Highway. The first one being that it's just not as rewatchable or fun as the rest of Lynch's filmography because it's like so dark and so stripped of humor. It's a really tough watch, even though I'm engaged all the way through. And the other one I already mentioned is that the second act is just a lot weaker than the first and the third. I think the transition from this dark portrait of this fractured marriage into this far less interesting noir-esque plotline is really jarring, but ultimately I do think it's necessary to make the film's third act work. So even in this slight nitpick, I do think there is a silver lining to it. Besides that, I really like Lost Highway. I think it's one of Lynch's most nightmarish movies and a really great example of how he can build atmosphere through his filmmaking. These dark hallways, the eerie sound design, and the really flat performances all really give the film a very unnerving effect that is very terrifying even when nothing specifically scary is happening on screen. It's also one of Lynch's most abstract films, which leads him into the final leg of his career where he just completely throws narrative coherence out of the window. I'll get more into that in my Inland Empire review and when I rank the rest of Lynch's filmography. But I think that the third act of Lost Highway is a great example of what happens when Lynch throws narrative cohesion out the window and just focuses on delivering very potent, powerful imagery. Later on in his career, he starts to act more on his emotions than actual logic. And I think that is when I like Lynch the most. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. I'm going to give Lost Highway a 4 out of 5. It's a real mind bender that falters in some moments, but ultimately wraps itself up really, really well. I'm going to be doing my Lynch ranking in probably a couple weeks. So yeah, look out for that. And that's it. Bye-bye.